We're really pleased to have you here, Jay. Two respects. One, Jay Gershuny is one of the probably the top, certainly among the top two or three researchers worldwide that look at how people use their time and the sociological, social science perspectives on time allocation, and which is probably how we spend our lives. What do we do with our time and so forth. And he's just joined the University of Oxford. I think the appointment came through last year, but I think you just actually landed in Oxford pretty solidly in December, and I expect that there'll be huge opportunities for involving Jay in as many of collaborative projects as possible, and it'll be a great bridge to the Department of Sociology here at Oxford between OII and our Oxford Internet surveys, all sorts of studies that we're doing that involve survey research, but also qualitative work on social behavior. I think wonderful opportunity to have an early sense of your work and what you're thinking about, and then we can you can introduce yourselves over the course of the next month or so in terms of he can get an idea who we have here and what work we're doing. So Jay, welcome, and wonderful to have you at Oxford.
Thank you very much. And in fact, what I decided that I would do, I've got a mic here. Okay. What I decided I would do is try to sell you a particular approach to understanding social structure, one that is particularly designed to try to capture the effect of technical change. And indeed, I should say, as the result of work that I was doing 20 years ago, trying to get some idea of what the effect of the microprocessor and what we were not yet calling the internet, but nevertheless was the internet in its previous incarnations, trying to get some picture of what its effect in the grandest sorts of terms is going to be on economic and social structure. And the conclusion that I came to when I was doing this work in the mid-1980s was that conventional economics and conventional economic sociology just didn't have a sufficient purchase on the whole sphere of people's daily activity. Economics looking at what we might call the registered economy, this thing up here, the thing that appears in the national product, that appears in what we used to call the blue books, the national accounts. There's lots of other places where economic activity actually carries on. Most of it not registered at all. Most important, private households. And I'll suggest in a moment the parallel between what private households do and what the money economy does. But of course there's voluntary, communal, collective, charitable activities that provide services and sometimes goods outside the money nexus, but nevertheless are providing services that might, or goods that might otherwise be provided by the money economy. And then there's this other thing, the unregistered economy, the hidden economy, people actually providing goods and services mostly for money, but sometimes for barter, but hidden for various reasons from the tax authority, from the tax authorities. And the point of laying it out in this way is to say that over time, and unlike some of the models that economic historians like to try to sell us, in fact, there isn't a mass movement of activity, an overall movement of activity away from these extra economic activities into the economy. On the contrary, when you actually try to understand the movement of activities between these various spheres within which economic activity takes place, you find that rather than a grand movement into the economy, you find that partly as a result of changes in regulation, in institutional arrangements, but very largely to do with technological change, you find economic activities moving not just into the economy, but out of the economy, into the household, into voluntary, into hidden production. And for that reason, this is really why I got into doing time use studies in the first place, to try to provide a more comprehensive picture of what goes on, not just in what economists call within the system of national accounts production boundary, that the SNAPB, but also within what economists call the general production boundary, that is, including all the things that you might think of as work, whether or not they're paid for or not, and then thinking also about consumption as well, because, as you'll see, the modes in which people consume goods and services are probably just as important for understanding the impact of technical change as processes of production. And the whole reason that I started off collecting time use data was to try to get this picture not merely of how economies operated in the sphere of exchange, but also in the sphere of reciprocal passing of favours or other non-monetary tokens between people, putting the exchange work and the reciprocal work and the consumption activity all in terms of the same sort of measure. And what I'm going to talk about here, and I suspect that and this is stuff that I've been working on for a very long time indeed, but I suspect that no one around here will have actually come across this material. What I'm going to do is really three things. I'm going to introduce, not necessarily in this order, I'm going to introduce a system of social accounts that's based jointly on time and on money. That's number one. And two, I'm going to show in general terms how technological changes and changes in social structure are represented in this alternative system of social accounts. And I'm also going to say a little bit about the potential of this approach for looking at social differentiation, though I suspect that may be not the central interest of this group. But as I said, my primary reason for talking about this here in this group is to try to see if I can turn any of you on with because I'm seriously interested in looking for collaborators in trying to understand the change in the socio-technical system using the sorts of methods that I'm going to be talking about. Okay, now I have to start off by some definitions. The first of these definitions is a structure, and a structure is a set of objects plus a set of defined relationships among them. And then you have a social structure, which is a set of individuals who've got given characteristics who relate to each other in ways that serve to enable the mutual satisfaction of their wants. So it's a particular sort of structure. And social position, which is something I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. Social position comes from characteristics that locate individuals within a structure. It's a rather tautologous sort of definition, but then the best definitions always are. However, the next one is not tautologous at all. It's a technology, and by a technology I mean something much broader than is normally meant by a technology, and you'll see why I put it this way in a minute. And by a technology, I mean a system for the satisfaction of human wants, and it consists of a set of artifacts embodied within a set of social relations. And I'm interested in the entire system, not just in the machines that happen to be used by the actors in that system. Now, this is where the language, rather than being merely definitions, I hope turns into useful definitions. The point of what I'm going to be saying is that technologies in this broad sense obviously include a number of different sorts of activity. The first activity is what we normally think of when we talk about technology, which is productive activities. Activities that take place in that top part in the system of within the system of national accounts production boundary, production. But also, technologies involve what Marx and other 19th century economists called reproduction. That is unpaid activity, but which has some work-like characteristics. That's the non-system of national accounts but activity, but still within the general production boundary. And the third element is it involves some consumption time. And the alternative term that I'm going to use for a technology is a chain of provision for human wants. That's to say, I'm going to try to look at the entire set of activities that goes to satisfy a particular sort of want. I'll make this much more concrete in just a moment. But I'm going to look at not just the production activities, the things going on in the economy, the things related to jobs, but also, and employment, but also at things that go on, productive activities that go on in households, and also at activities that are not either production or reproduction in that conventional term, but are simply consumption. Because, of course, different technologies for satisfying different ways of satisfying particular wants involve not just different sorts of work, but also different classes of consumption activity. And then I'm going to think about technological diffusion as the change in the balance between alternative modes of provision. So we have systems, chains of activities, paid work and unpaid work and consumption time that satisfy a want in one particular way, and technological diffusion is a shift in the set of activities both in production and in reproduction and consumption that go to satisfy. And it corresponds, very closely to the terminology that transport researchers use when they talk, for example, about shift in the modal split. Modes of transport, public transport against private transport in general terms, for example, and a shift in the modal split actually means a shift in various sorts of paid employment. It means a shift in various sorts of unpaid work, people driving their own cars, and a shift in different sorts of activities. First of all, you're travelling in a car rather than in a bus, or vice versa. But also it may be that the quantities involved. In fact, it is very likely that the quantities of these different activities, the quantities of time, are different. And now I think you may be beginning to see where I'm going with time use and all these definitions. Okay. But before we get on to the accounting, let me give you some examples. It's all very abstract so far. Here are some historical shifts in modal split. I've already mentioned transport. And you've got trips by bus and train being substituted by a different system that involved people buying certain sorts of capital equipment. They bought motor cars, and they buy certain sorts of materials like petrol, and then they use their unpaid work to steer themselves about, and the people who had driven in their cars then become private car passengers rather than. Okay, so you've got a shift in activities that has enormous implications, not just for the structure of the economy, but for the organisation of daily life. Entertainment, you didn't go to the cinema, you bought a television. Very similar sorts of process. You bought hardware, you acquired some sorts of software, and you combined these things to consume a service in your home that maybe you used to consume out of your home, for example. Again, a shift, change in the modal split. Big shift in the way you set about consuming the ways in which you set about consuming goods and services, but most important, it's a change in the way you satisfy your wants. Domestic functions. No domestic servants, but lots of domestic equipment. And again, the same mixture of new capital that's taken out of the economy, put in something that is not the economy, but is nevertheless from Marx it would be a reproductive, but we can think of it frankly as a productive unit. More capital in the household, more work using that capital to produce services that maybe you used to buy from the money economy. That's the 20th century modal split. And now here are the things that actually started me thinking about this back in the 1980s when I started to do this work, and that is what the effect of this joint telecommunications, computing, new technology just emerging in the 70s and 80s was going to be. And in exactly the same way, you have at least the prospect of new ways, new modes of provision for old wants. Just as you'd had in the 20th century, the shift, for example, from serviced shopping to self-serviced shopping that had all sorts of consequences for consequences for employment and time use outside employment. Some of which we'll see in just a moment. Just as you had this move from serviced to self-serviced shopping that actually meant externalizing a lot of activities from the money economy into the household, what you might think of as the household economy, through the middle part of the 20th century, and with downstream consequences also for other sorts of paid work in producing the capital equipment that was used in order to satisfy the needs, the wants in this way. Just as you had that modal shift in the 20th century, so we could think forward into the 21st century in the most general terms of those now extended trips all the way out to the hypermarket and then driving around looking for somewhere to park and then walking into and taking stuff off the shelves and then queuing to have it taken and then driving yourself home and portering the stuff upstairs. Instead of that, you switch on you press the right button on your machine, and a friendly voice from Tesco says, "Is your order this week the same as last week's order? Check stuff off." It doesn't quite work that simply in Tesco's, but it bloody well ought to, and eventually it will. And so the extra 20 or 30 minutes a day, which we'll see people ended up spending as a result of these shifts in the 20th century, that took away from the grocer chap that I remember, who used to say to my mum, "Will it be the same this week, Mrs. Gershuny, and I'll send the boy round with it." And a nice little package appeared. So you would say there's at least the potential for a similar package to appear and be posted through a letterbox at the bottom of my door through utterly different technological processes that we all know about, but we don't need to pursue. So the shift that was enabled by one sort of technology in one century, the next century on by this technology that we're all particularly interested in, can actually transform the mode of provision for this particular sort of service in a way that sort of reverses, but interesting and complex way reverses the changes that we saw in the last century. Personal services, similarly, it's not queuing for the doctor. Okay, you will still queue for the doctor, but probably the queuing will be a bit more efficient. And a lot of those services you'll actually be able to get down the tubes rather than going to see the doctor in the first place, and he can actually provide a lot of services for you remotely. We all know that all that telechiric experimental stuff, whether we believe it or not is another matter, but there we are here, and there's my third speculation, which is about business and recreational travel. I didn't do it, but my colleague Anthony Heath did a televiva yesterday with a student in Holland and an external examiner, very external indeed, in Western Canada. That an excuse for a jolly has disappeared, but probably good for the environment. And it's not necessarily just work trips as well. I mean, increasingly we're now speculating about the. Okay, so here are 3 examples of similar sorts of changes that can take place, and that you can track through the system in the way that I'm going to show you in just a moment. Okay, so new IT-based services. So far I've been talking about technology, but of course technology operates in a regulatory environment, and in fact public regulation, you can think of that as being an alternative source of innovation in these chains of provision that I'm talking about. It's not just the technology that changes, but given any technology, it's the regulatory environment of costs, costs and requirements within which that particular technology is actually operating. And again, you can see different ways in which changes in the regulatory environment can affect and of course the thought in my head is that it's these changes in the regulatory environment that go hand in hand with the technological changes to enable, encourage, discourage, or whatever the changes the changes in the distributions of the different modes of provision for once. Okay, what I'm going to do is to give you an empirical example of the sort of accounting that you can do that looks much more generally than just at the economy. And I'm going to use these 3 data sets. They're there on the slide. I don't need to take you through them, but they're big, national, randomly sampled diary data sets with, of the order of 10 to 15,000 days of data in each case, and each of the days looks pretty much like this, and you won't. This is the one bit that you can't quite see. That says 7 o'clock to 7:10, sleeping. Hopefully he's been asleep before this. Normally the diaries start at 4 in the morning, so there's a lot of. So this is the second page of the diary. He gets up. He had a shower, made breakfast, ate breakfast while reading a newspaper. He was with his children, were you with other people, and so on. It takes you through, essentially minute by minute, through your day, so you can see personal consumption, you can personal care, eating, what you might think of as maybe unpaid work, getting my son dressed. Unpaid work in the sense that you could pay someone else to do it for you and get the same result, maybe even better result. And then travel to work and so on. So the whole set of things that you do in your day, that one does in one's day, is here in these. We've got large random samples, so we're representing all the activities in the. Now, what were you doing? We've got on the diary. What else were you doing? Where were you? Were you with anybody? We can also, of course, collect. Were you using any equipment? Were you on? Indeed, we have done diaries of exactly this sort, and in another context, I'd be very happy to come back and talk about that, the narrow internet research that my colleagues have been engaged in over the last few years. But here we're using a general purpose diary and trying to get a picture of the overall pattern of activities and long-term historical changes. And we've got these data going back, these diary surveys, representative diary surveys, going right back to the 1960s. So, and what I'm going to do is show you how you can track through the effects of changes in modes of provision for once, using these time use surveys. Surely? Yes, I should have said, interrupt me, please. And it's going to get a bit technical in a moment, so please interrupt me more from now on.
Just a simple
Bill.
question. Say, for example, when the
Yeah.
guy's dressing his son,
Yeah.
and he says, also I was talking to my son.
Yeah.
It seems like there must be a lot of individual variation in whether people elaborate on what else they're doing versus, how do you deal with that?
What we assume is that there's an error, that there's simply an error associated, that there's going to be information missing in some cases, but we've got some basis for thinking that that information is missing relatively at random, because we do various experiments with different sorts of instruments, and we find rough consistency in multiple activity patterns across these, so that the obvious worry that you would have is that more literate people are more likely to say you would get a biased. Well, I cannot say that does not happen, but what I can say is that is that at the very least, or at the very worst, there's a whole set of compensating biases that mean that, which mean that relatively poorly educated people are about as likely to represent their secondary activities as well-educated ones. This argument might we don't know why it works like this. We're just very pleased that it does. But the sorts of guesses that we make is that the better educated people might be too busy, or take it for granted that these simultaneous activities might be understood, despite the fact we've asked them to record them, so on. Or alternatively, that the less well-educated people are more literal-minded and less able to discriminate what's the important thing and what's the. But the bottom line, whatever the reason is, it does appear that these instruments do actually record without evident biases when you compare light and heavy instruments, for example.
And are you more interested in the aggregation of this or in the individual?
Well, there's lots of different uses of these data. Very often, and in fact, what I'm going to do here is just rather monstrous aggregations of these activities. But we're also interested, for example, in what produces the daily sequences, and so we try to model the patterns of recurrence of activities through the day. So we look sequentially at the day using, for example, event history modeling techniques, or DNA matching, to look at the similarity of sequences among different people. Use programs that originally came from DNA matching programs, and so there's lots of different ways of using the data. Another of them is looking at the packing of activities. So you look at multiple activities and you get some idea of how busy people are. That's another way of using the data. But we record all the information, and we use it for whatever purposes we're doing, which you'll very soon see the sort of purpose that I'm going to now. What I'm going to do now is to show you a very simple time use accounting. It's so obvious as to be trivial as soon as I show it to you, but it relies on the proposition, which is a true proposition, which is that not only that individuals have just 1,440 minutes in their days, and it is 1,440 minutes, I promise you, and for some reason most people don't know that fact. 1,440 minutes in the day, you'll see that number recurring. You could also think not just of the individuals each having 1,440 minutes, but of course the society as a whole has just 1,440 great minutes, which is those minutes, times the 61 million or whatever the base is. So I'm going to be talking about the great minutes of the day, and all of those great minutes, I'm going to say, can be classified as either paid work, or unpaid work, or consumption time. So that is one primary. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you mind on what?
Indeed.
I just have a little conceptual difficulty with unpaid work.
Yeah.
It seems to me that, I can look forward to a moment where I have 24-hour care. I mean, if I can
Yeah, but
I
right.
with my shoes on, you get that.
Yeah.
I used to go out in all those discussions whether housewives should be paid for housework. And you say, surely she shouldn't be paid for making her own bed. I mean, there's a fundamental
Right, I've got you.
We could pay for anything we do.
I've got you. What we have is, since I've started working on this, I discovered that there's an ancient history of this that I can actually trace back, for example, to the Hebrew term for work, which is melacha. And melacha means it's something that you can send to be done. So it's an idea that's actually written into the language. Melacha, work, something that you can send out. And the modern version of this comes, for example, from, I always thought he was one doesn't say Eskimo anymore. I thought he was an Eskimo. He's a Canadian statistician called Olli Horelichen. It turns out that Horelichen is in fact Hungarian, not an Eskimo name. But anyway, Olli Horelichen produced the third-person criterion, and he said, a review of income and wealth in the mid-1970s, he said, work is anything that you could pay some third party to do for you without losing the core utility, the core direct utility that you derive from it. Now, that raises almost as many questions as it solves, because I actually like washing floors, I have to say, and I get a direct satisfaction. And if I pay someone to wash my floor, this is absolutely untrue, but you see what I mean. Should I like washing floors and then pay someone, I would lose some direct. However, putting that sort of objection aside, by work I mean anything that's identified by the third-person criterion. You can actually pay some. You like interacting with your son while he's getting dressed, but nevertheless, you can pay someone to dress your son, and he is reliably, as I said, he possibly even more reliably dressed if you don't do it. You see what I mean. The third-person criterion, that's what I mean by unpaid work. And what we've got is paid work and unpaid work, and you decide that as to whether you're being paid for it. And of course, most of the work that I've done in the last 45 years is very difficult for me to work. 35 years is difficult for me to work out whether I was actually paid for doing it or not, but you know what I mean. Paid work, unpaid work, and everything else is consumption time. And you can divide those 1,440 minutes into those three categories. That's straightforward. Less straightforward, but nevertheless no more complex than the sorts of things that national income accountants find themselves called on to do on a daily basis. You could actually arrive at a comprehensive classification of human wants. And the one I've got here says that everyone wants to sleep, everyone wants some sort of shelter, household operation, nutrition, home leisure, travel out of home leisure, medicine, education, similar services, and background services. And I can organize things so that everything, as I'm going to show you, everything that you do falls into one of those, how many is it? 6. Everything falls into one of those 6 categories. In fact, when I did the classification, I had not these 6, but I think 19 or 21 different categories. But it doesn't matter. I can identify, and at the worst, I can have an other category, and everything else that doesn't fit neatly into these goes into the other. But you see what I mean. It's just as paid work, unpaid work, consumption time exhausts the 1,440 minutes. So I'm going to say these 6 categories of wants exhaust the 1,440 minutes. So you can classify everything into you can cross-classify everything into work meeting this particular sort of want, or unpaid work meeting that sort of. Got it. Okay, that's what we're about. And okay, 3 steps. Entirely straightforward. First of all, you associate each individual's leisure and unpaid work time with the appropriate category of want. The second thing, and I'll go through these at least the first separately, and then look at the second. You can associate the money values of each item of final output with these same categories. And then you can trace for the money value of those, for each pound's worth of food or motor car or educational service. You can use the conventional economic accounting systems, the national accounts, input-output matrices, and so on, to trace these things back into the amount of work that has gone to produce those particular commodities in different industries and so on. Okay, it's straightforward. It's fiddly, but conceptually it's entirely straightforward. And the first step is simply associating wants and time use categories. So on the left-hand side, on the left-hand column, I've got these 6. They've turned into 7 categories. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No, they've turned into 8 categories, but I think you still see where we're going. I've got sleep, shelter, and clothing separately, and there's a background services that I'll come back to in a minute. And then what I've done is gone to my diaries, and I've, as Bill said, I've simply aggregated the first activities to get the 1440 minutes, and then I associate all of those minutes that are either in the unpaid work category or in the leisure time category with particular of these wants, because in fact I've classified them in my when I went through the diaries and I classified the diaries, I've got something like 350 activity categories that they go into, and I can say now, okay, if this person is eating, well, it's obviously meeting the want for nutrition, and if he's looking after his children, it reads, well, as I've got it here, other domestic, but that's okay. So straightforwardly, we can take the time diary data and allocate it in this way. Now, what we've got here is that's the matrix, but it's only partially populated at the moment, and I've populated it with these 2 categories. So we've got, for the adults aged 18 plus in the society, we've got 1,011 minutes of, well, I've called it leisure consumption time, and we've got 224. This is in 2001 survey, the Office of National Statistics. You've got 224 minutes of unpaid work done by various people, and then you've got, well, this total of about, is it 12, about 200 minutes of paid work. That, well, we already know this from the diary, because we've actually collected other information about who these people are. So we know that we're getting 34 minutes from in the great day. We're getting 34 minutes per day from medical, educational, and similar professionals, 47 from managers, scientists, and so on, 62 from other service workers, and 62 from. Okay, so we've partially populated this matrix, and now all we've got to do, in order to get a complete picture of what's going on in the society, what we've got to do is to say, now, how do each of these different sorts of work relate to these different sorts of want? Okay, and what we do there is, again, I mean, there are other ways of doing it. You could do it by a survey, but this is done on an entirely a priori basis. I've gone through, first of all the categories of household spending, and also all the final products of the society that aren't purchased by households but are free at the point of consumption. Public housing, sewers ain't actually, so a little bit of those is going to be there, but there's still some public subsidy for works and so on. So what I've done is allocated basically all household spending and all government and charitable spending, allocating comprehensively, again, all of the different categories of household expenditure or of public provision against these categories of want. Okay, and then I work through the input-output data to tell me what this is telling me about the currently unpopulated cells of the matrix. Now, it's actually slightly more complicated than that, but only slightly more complicated than that. And this is a national accounts. You see, well, there are two complications. Complication one is this national accounting point that I'm going to deal with now. There's also, you'll see in a moment, an issue of imports and exports, because I talked about the 1440 minutes of the Great Day, but of course there's part of the Great Day that gets exported in goods and services, and also part of other countries' Great Days that gets imported. So I'll deal with that in a moment. But the crucial thing here is about investment expenditure, because of course final output is a combination of government final provision of services and households' consumption of services and investment goods. Okay. But the obvious thing to say, that's on an annual basis, that's what's going on. But you don't invest just because you like investing. You invest because you want to provide certain sorts of services, or maybe you want to export things. But the investment is always for some sort of purpose. So if you say that you're not actually looking at this year's time budget, but at a longer time, you then say, well, which are the industries that this investment is going to? In principle, you do know this. In practice, I've made some assumptions about where this investment is going to and built them into what I've done. But essentially, you can sort of endogenize this activity so that not just final expenditure from households and government provision, but also the investment expenditure that's going to satisfy these sorts of wants. The public and the private investment expenditure for each sort of want is also allocated to this. Okay, so that deals with one of the two problems. The other problem is the import-export, and you'll see how that's dealt with in the next, because there's the full matrix. And there we have it, 1440 minutes at the bottom there, and these are the totals that come out of the time diary. So much leisure, so much unpaid work, so much work from these different sorts of people. But now we can look across and we can say, okay, in order to satisfy the society's wants for this or for that, we've got so many manual workers and so many service workers and managers and scientists and professional workers, and we've got so much unpaid work, and we've got so much consumption time. Okay, before I carry on, let me just say how we deal with imports and exports. We actually know how much of our time is embodied in exports, actually from the very same economic statistics that tell us about the very same input-output tables that tell us about how what the ultimate origins are of the sorts of commodities that we buy or that the government provides for us. We also know what the value and with a reasonably straightforward piece of accounting, then the time of different sorts of workers is built into the bundle of goods and services that we export. So that in fact we've got about 41 minutes of the Great Day in the UK is exported. Quite a lot when you think about it, when there's only about 200 minutes of paid work altogether. About a fifth of the day goes in providing goods and services for societies outside the UK. Now, so far so good. We also know how many goods and services are imported, which sorts of goods and services are imported, and how they relate to these different sorts of wants. What I haven't done properly is tried to work out how much time is how much time is really embodied in the goods and services that are coming in. What I used in order to produce this final column, which you'll see is not actually implicated in the 1440 minutes, which is reasonably straightforward. What I've done is simply assumed that there's approximately the same labour content in goods and services imported for each of these purposes as there is internally. That's wrong, obviously. We're importing Nike shoes, and we know that the labour content of a pound's worth of Nike shoes is far and above the labour content of a pound's worth of shoes bought in the UK. So it may look as if we're nicely imbalanced there. That's the 41 minutes that we of our time that we export, and that number's probably right. That 43 minutes of imported time. Well, it's interesting that it should balance, I suppose, but in fact, of course, it doesn't balance, and my guess is that it's going to be about twice as large. Doesn't affect this calculation. But of course, one thing that you could do is think about the pattern of cross-national exploitation by looking at these real-time balances. But that's not my interest, because of course, what my real interest is, as I started off by saying, in these balances of time in different sorts of activities that go to satisfy particular sorts of wants. Because it's these balances of time that are affected by changes in technology and by shifts in the modal splits, shift in the ways people set about satisfying their wants. And it's through these sorts of numbers that you get to understand what the effects of technological change really are. And you can see not just in terms of the balances of different sorts of employment, but also the balances between different sorts of paid work and different sorts of unpaid work and consumption. And I'll just give you some examples of this now.
Question: do I read this correctly? We sleep 9.5 hours on average. It's like
yes.
The only thing that doesn't pass my common sense test.
It's sleep, rest, and associated activity. So personal care is in there. Also, they're not food. I have to say that number is very, very stable. I mean, I haven't talked about the major piece of work that I've been doing over the last decade is putting together the multinational time use study, which has about 50 time use surveys of this sort from 30 different countries. And this number of sleep varies. Sleep and personal care varies by 15, 20 minutes across the. Frankly, I know the surveys are working because it doesn't vary very much. Okay, that's the picture for 2001. Just very briefly, 1983-4. That was the previous survey. What's happened to sleep? Yes, 8 minutes different there. It's hunting a bit, and maybe there's survey differences. In fact, though, in the particular groups of people, sleep time does vary quite a lot. And when you look at, for example, the sequence of activities through the day, you see the lengthening of the day into the night that's come with all-night television. And also the lengthening of the unpaid work day into the evening that's come with late and the weekend and Sundays that's come with. So you can actually track those sorts of temporal changes. Go on.
I'm not making a point. A question of understanding. I've had to make a shift in understanding this. I thought at first this is going to be a picture of, as it were, the median individual, but it's not. It's a kind of leviathan.
It's a leviathan. It's exactly. It's the whole fish.
So, I mean, to be consistent then, you might as well distribute sleep across the types of work.
Oh, yes, you certainly can.
You could fill those cells if you chose.
I could, yes. No, that's right. No, you're exactly right. And all I'm going to do here is give you this sort of picture. But the point is exactly right, that you can look not just at the overall balance, which is what you have to consider when you're thinking about the scope for technological change. You can look at the consequences of technological change or organizational change for individuals through this. I think I have just one example because I took all the other examples out of the version of this that I've come. But had I been preparing this for a sociological audience, I would have been talking much more about social differentiation and the different pictures of social differentiation. I'll give you a little bit of that. But yes, that's of course one of the major applications of exactly this sort of. Okay, so what we've got here is 2000, mid-80s, 1960, 1961, and let me just take you through. Some examples of the changes that we see. First of all, shift in the balance of the great day. This is where it's going between satisfying different sorts of needs. Okay, look at just the final panel here from 61 to 2001, the percentage of the day. And thank goodness you find exactly what you'd hope to find in a developing society. And that is that you're spending less of the great day, consumption, unpaid work and paid work. You're spending less of the great day satisfying basic needs and more of the great day satisfying more sophisticated luxury needs. I've just added up the numbers here.
Can I just ask, because this is all based on the language of substitution.
Yeah, exactly so.
But obviously, since we're all dealing with technology, we all talk about multitasking, doing a lot of things at the same time. And I'm just, because you have this fixed number of minutes, I don't think you're going to be able to reflect that actually we're spending.
Actually, you can. Actually,
okay.
you can.
Good.
And you do it straightforwardly. Remember that now, potentially, of course, if you've got just a primary activity, what you're doing, so you've got potentially whatever, you've got potentially 2,880 minutes. That's not a sensible way of thinking about it. The right way to think about those two columns is to say you've got some single activities and some combined activities. So you can still make, if you've got multiple activities, you can still make your 1440 minutes because some of those 1440 minutes are spent in childcare and some of those 1440 minutes are spent watching television, and some of those 1440 minutes are actually spent watching television with your child. Yep. So and the data is really flexible because you've got it in this sequential form. You can always, if that's what you're interested in, you can always organise it so that you can count that. So you can count that amount of money. Now, so you can count that amount of time.
Yes, I was thinking. Yeah. No, I was wondering if the data could reflect that we have become more of multitaskers.
And indeed, it could. I mean, first of all, you can see the density of packing of activities, and you do actually find a certain increase in density of packing. We've got a study. We've got a paper coming out in Social Indicators Research later this year, which is actually not this UK data, but an exactly parallel set of US data that shows exactly that going on. And as we get to think through this sort of accountancy at how the technology is affecting. You would look particularly at consumption time and ask yourself, is in fact this time that you're spending, for example, in front of a computer screen, what are you doing at the same time while you're doing that? And the best of the surveys actually has not just primary activity and secondary activity, but up to 4 simultaneous activities, and you can then trace these complex combined activities in relation to particular of these. But none of that appears here. It's all much more simple-minded for the moment. So that's the shift in the balance of the great day, and it shifts in the way you'd expect it to, from less sophisticated to more sophisticated consumption activities. Again, you can look at the shift in the occupational balance. Okay, because remember what we've got at one part of this table is, what's the balance of, this relates to that 1970s and 80s concern with de-skilling. What's happening to the workforce, and we can see quite straightforwardly that service workers because it's a complex definition and different sorts of services are coming along, but the number of service workers is relatively stable. But the numbers of consumer professionals, engineers, scientists, and so on is expanding very, very rapidly, and of course, as you disaggregate, you can find out where it is, in which chains of provision these people are actually involved in. You can track that, and manual workers again, this is exactly what you know from other statistics. But here you've got the beginnings of some sorts of explanations for why it's going on, in terms of shifts in the sorts of wants that are being satisfied, and shifts in the combinations of activities that are going to satisfy those wants. Okay.
Who are consumer professionals? They're
consumer professionals are teachers, doctors, and other people providing high value services. Here's another big change. Sorry.
Did you use any of the information worker categories, which sort of map onto that in quite a bit awkwardly? Actually.
Not properly, but there's no reason that you shouldn't. And in fact, if this is the purpose of what you're doing, then you do it that way. It would be possible to get the 2001 data, which has a very good occupational classification. It would be possible uses the standard occupational. There's an ISOC and a what's the UK standard classification? It's the standard UK classification. It was collected by the Office of National Statistics. So, you can map a standard 3-digit occupational classification. You can map a standard information worker classification onto that if you're interested. So that's the shift in the occupational balance, and we could just as well have had along in the first columns different categories of information worker. Plotted, though, as I say, I don't think you could get back to 1960. Indeed, I know you could not go back to 1961 because the occupational classification is, for reasons that I'm happy to explain, vastly inferior. But certainly, most recently, for the mid-80s and the 2001, you certainly can do that. Another remarkable change is growth in unpaid work time, particularly between the 60s and the 80s. And in fact, that's strongly associated with a particular set of technological changes that I think is going to be the very next thing that we're going to see. But remember, we had during this period, from the middle of the last century to the end, this growth in self-servicing, and you can see particularly from the 60s to the mid-80s, this very large growth in unpaid work that corresponds to this self-service era, and in fact, an awful lot of that is shopping. Right. These are changes in amounts of time devoted to particular sorts of services. Eating at home, going, almost disappearing. No, it's not at all disappearing, but it's reduced by 50%. Internationally, that's a regularity. France still spends the longest time eating, but every single country, including France, has reduced the amount of time that it spends in eating. Going out has been increasing. Using a different data set, what I've been able to demonstrate is that it's not just that going out increases, but that people who use the internet actually go out more for rather obvious reasons. Exactly the opposite of what that chap in Stanford, who am I thinking of? Norman Nye. Exactly the opposite of what Norman Nye said. Internet actually increases, at least is associated with an increase in sociability, not a decrease in sociability. But generally, going out has been increasing over this time. Childcare has been increasing quite dramatically, but most dramatically, there's the shopping time. That is this technological change that I was talking about, the change in the mode of provision of retail services that simply transformed the amount. And this, of course, is the opportunity, and this is why I talk about the possibility for internet-based shopping. I mean, you know, there's the market in front of you. There's the market in front of you. I should be saying to these. Indeed, I did say to Mr. Sainsbury, to Lord Sainsbury, now go away and make your millions, make your billions. That's the market. There's your market for you.
But this might be what people enjoy doing.
Well, that's right.
It's going out.
It's more. No, that's actually right. And in fact, what you need to do is to work out exactly what sort of shopping they're doing and what they're doing in their shopping, and make sure that the shopping that you actually the actual personal shopping time you provide with them is rewarding, entertaining, and meets other sorts of needs. Whereas the routine marketing is which is frankly what built that huge growth over the last half century. That the routine marketing disappears, so that at least some of that time that you might save by the internet is substituted for by other more pleasurable retail experiences. I think that would be the right way to.
Are these time used because it's they're registered? Do you have parallel research that goes back and actually see, okay, we find the shift, now let's talk to the people and see, have specified interviews with specific groups?
I've never done that, I have to say. It'd be a very interesting thing to do. There are people who have talked, there are social researchers who've talked about the impact of technological change on, not just on the numbers, but also on their lived experience. I mean, my favourite example here is the Linns. Does anyone know the Middletown books? Famous American, wonderful stuff. And you actually, and they talked to people, and they were talking about the impact of, among other things, the impact of technological change on this middle-sized town in the middle of the US in 1937, 1938, and they talked to them about the impact of the motor car and the radio, and extraordinary things came out, like, the importance of the motor car for improving family cohesion, because you go out on Sunday afternoons and those kids are trapped in the back seat and they can't go anywhere else, so they have to talk to their parents, said one of the Linns informants. Well, that was something I didn't know was it was only a temporary effect of the motor car, because within 20 years those bloody kids had their own motor cars and didn't talk to their parents ever again. But that's not.
Television was the same. It used to bring people together.
Exactly. Now,
but I would hazard a guess. I mean, knowing nothing, that the shopping is different. I live with several professional shoppers, and I have a hunch that provides standards. And that's consistent with the fact that, as you say, Tesco now will provide all your standard wants in a box every week, because that just frees professional shoppers up
for doing it seriously. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I think that we must be related in some way. Okay, we're getting to the end. I mean, so far I've just been talking about macro stuff, and I haven't left any micro stuff in there except for this particular way of thinking about distribution, which is about inequality, not in terms of money, but inequality in terms of time. Because remember, I said everyone has 1,440 minutes per day, except that, of course, not everyone has 1,400. In fact, most people of working age have remarkably fewer than 1,440 minutes per day. If you work, the working population probably work 400 minutes a day, something like that, 350 minutes a day at their paid work, and that's time that's lost to them. So it's 1,440 minutes minus that 350 minutes. But hold on, by working, they acquire some money that allows them to buy minutes of other people's time. And of course, if they're very well paid, they can buy a lot of other people's time. So you can think not in terms of how rich people are. Think about differentiation, social differentiation, not just in terms of how rich people are in terms of money, but also how rich people are in terms of time. And obviously, people I've taken a human capital score here, and I've worked out for the most recent of our surveys that approximately the average for the whole the human capital score is something like a shadow wage rate, and this is something like the hourly wage that the average person might expect to be able to earn. And then you can organise the whole sample, the whole adult sample, from the people with the lowest human capital score to the people with the highest human capital score. Okay, and you would say that those in the bottom decile have a human capital score of their potential earnings is well below they're not employed basically. Their potential earnings are well below the minimum. You buy for every minute of the bottom decile worker can only buy for every minute of that person's time 0.43 of a minute of the average worker, whereas the top decile person can buy 2.76 minutes of the average worker. And so what you've got is that the poorest people have, this is the end of the point, about 1,300 minutes in their day, and the richest people have about 1,900. The richest group of people in the society have about 1,900 minutes in their day. It's a different way of thinking about inequality in the society, and of course, different ways of providing for wants, high technology ways, low technology ways, ways of providing services free by the state as opposed to having to purchase them on the market. All of these things have consequences not just on consumption time and on unpaid work time, but also on the distribution of employment and on the relative wages of workers, and hence generate greater or lesser inequality. So that's the story. What I've been intending to construct is a framework for thinking about the social impact of technical and other sorts of changes. You can do this same thing for lots of countries. So you can do cross-national comparison. I've shown you some historical stuff. It provides us with a quite different way of thinking about the occupational structure and what determines the shape of the occupational structure, and it provides us with new ways of thinking about inequality and social differentiation as well. And it's a method of thinking about social structure that's based explicitly on a concern with technologies and with technological change and with their social impact. Okay, that's a macro. Now I'm open to offer. That's a macro picture. I want to move forward. I've got at least 10 years of useful working life, I hope, and we've got lots of information, and we're happy to collect lots more information, and we're looking for people to collaborate both in collecting this information and in analysing it and in jointly advancing our understanding of these things that we're all interested in. And that's it.
So could I, Jay, you've shown no survey research. What do you think of survey research? It's just not reliable.
Survey research?
Well,
you mean
but
attitude
diary
survey?
versus diary versus Well, we got into this discussion with John Robinson, for example. I mean, he just doesn't regard anybody's survey responses on how they spend, whether they spend more or less time, or how many hours,
Right.
versus diary. I mean, the diary study is a distinctive type of survey research.
Right. Oddly enough, John is phoning me up almost daily to say, how about our paper? And our paper is on exactly
Oh, really?
this
Okay.
issue. The short answer is resolved this way. Last week, how much time did you spend working?
Oh, right.
Exactly. Okay, that's it. The bottom line is people do not know the answers to these questions, but people answer questions nevertheless, despite the fact that they don't know the answers to questions. And regularly, if you ask a comprehensive set of time use questions, for example, it's well known that you arrive at a total of something between 28 and 29 hours per day, which doesn't reflect anything other than people's ignorance of their own time use. There's also a set of in effect experiments where we both ask people how they spend their time, use the questionnaire item, and we do diaries, and there's all sorts of systematic variations for paid work. You get a simple systematic variation, and that is that for every claimed hour above, for every questionnaire claimed hour above 45 hours a week, there's only 30 minutes of diary evidence. People who say they're working 60 hours a week in response to the labour force survey questions, as far as we can tell from diaries which look sequentially through their time, those people tend to be working about 52 hours, 53 hours, that sort of. There are similar problems that come from estimating unpaid work, and no one would dream of estimating, for example, television by asking how much television did you watch last week. You could work it out, of course, because you can probably remember what programs you watch, but that would be, in effect, to do a clumsy diary exercise, and it would take you a good 30 minutes to work out how much television you actually watched, as opposed to the impression that has to be delivered to the interviewer in. So my answer is in relation to these time use questions on things like the internet survey, is that they ain't worth the. Yeah, okay, I would say that, wouldn't I? But there's a lot of evidence that supports that.
But I think in principle, because I don't think anybody would do a survey and say, okay, now we know exactly what people think and what they do.
Yeah.
But if in principle everybody has the same error of estimation, so then you could compare people still. Just as long as there's not a group of people who consistently overestimates their time and another group of people who consistently underestimates their time. Or if you're just interested in comparing, like saying which activity has greater priority.
With some care, I mean, I'll immediately yield, yes, that's right. If that's all the evidence you've got, then you can make some sort of use of it. But how much better to collect proper diary evidence that would, for example, allow you to see what people are doing at the same time, your very question. Because almost no one while I spend, probably 8 hours a day in front of some sort of screen or other, I don't actually spend all my time doing one thing on that screen, and I'm normally doing a dozen other things at the same time. And what you would hope is that you've got a research instrument that tells you what those other things are, or even better, what it is you're doing on that screen. And again, it's one thing to say how much time do you spend in front of your in front of your monitor, and quite another to say how much time do you spend searching for goods and services, and how much time do you. Well, you don't know the answer. Don't know the answer to that. But with an appropriately designed diary survey, you might begin internet use survey. You might actually internet use diary. You might actually be able to. You are actually able to make some inferences about what's really going on. It's the right. I mean, my view is that it's the right methodology.
But there are, I mean, for example, reporting of income, there are, for example, gender differences in the
Oh,
biases of different genders in terms of over
And
or under reporting.
That's certainly right, and in fact, the self-reported income is not by any means the best way for all purposes of measuring income. You're very often, if you look at the Family Expenditure Survey or the Family Resources Survey as it is now, where you actually look at what household expenditure is, and it's calculated on the basis of an expenditure diary, you actually end up with a much better picture of actually what the household budget is than you do if you just ask the estimate question. And that's in a case where, in principle, most people should know their own income. I think I know what. Actually, I don't know what my income is now I think about it. But if I knew someone was coming to ask me, I would be able to find out, and I could do it quite simply. Whereas if I knew someone was coming to ask me how much childcare I'd done in the last year, I wouldn't know how to find it out. And that's the point. Are you asking questions about? Well, you know that people answer questions. That's the business of being an interviewee. But the question you as an interviewer or as an organizer of interviewers have to ask yourself is, do they actually know the answer of the question that they're going to be answering? And the bottom line is that for time use, people don't know, and they don't know because there isn't, in most cases, a good reason for them to know it. The categories we're asking about are artificial researchers categories that, while they may be very revealing to social scientists studying daily life, are nevertheless not the sort of thing that people need to know in their own daily lives, and therefore they don't carry around knowledge of those of the answers in their heads.
All this makes it all more puzzling that most Western societies are moving towards tax self-assessment, doesn't it? You see what I mean? Where you
I
say
think,
what you earned rather than they say. But if we all
yeah, but they also. But I don't know. I hope you've never been.
It is relevant because if people systematically underestimate what they earn,
Yeah.
what you're saying. I mean, you wouldn't think the tax authorities would let us go to self-assessment.
Well,
Some groups overestimate.
Or when all was over it. Yeah.
So it's
and
very-
they also have some independent tests, some independent checks, and of course, I don't have. When I'm trying to find out how much television people watch, I don't actually have
Oh, but with
Jigtar
interviews,
does.
you
Jigtar does, and there are passive registers. You can do some sorts of checks, but those don't match very nicely on the self-report. For obvious reasons, the amount of time the television is switched on is an hour to 90 minutes longer than the amount of time reported that people report watching it, and that's because most of the time, a good part of the time the television's on, no one's watching it, and so on.
Can I ask, picking up, you said you weren't wanting to talk too much about differentiation and
Yeah.
stratification. That's something I'm particularly interested in as it happens.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm doing some work on the social distribution of information from a normative point of view.
Yeah.
And can you say anything about what the relationship is, in your view, between the social distribution of information or the digital divide, which is one aspect of that, and the social distribution of time or leisure? I mean, in the old days we talked about leisure, the theory of the leisure class, David, and all that stuff. So that isn't new. But what you've got is a lot of new takes and new data in that.
Right.
How would that relate to the digital divide of the social distribution of information?
Well, this is a question that we're very interested.
Yeah.
We're very interested in, and we did, as I said to begin with, we ran a small time use panel study that was actually funded by British Telecom around the turn of around the millennium, actually to try to track internet and home computer users as against others. So we tried to look at the impact of the digital divide on the data set. Is sitting around and waiting to be, it's you can just pick it up And not only can you look at things like the different activity patterns of people who have different sorts of technology, because we ask endless questions about what technology they have in their home. But you can also look at the correlates of people using these various sorts of information technology for their other activities. And in fact, not only that, you can look at, because it's a panel study, we got people to keep diaries for a week in each of 3 successive years. You can actually look at what the effect of change in the use of the technology is on their other activities. Now, the only work that I've ever published using this data set was in Social Forces a couple of years ago, where, in fact, this was the Norman Nye article that you must have seen, because I think we're going to appear in a book at some point. The Malcolm Brynin book, do you know? No, you're not. Not in that. What I did in that article was look at the correlation between, look at the association between change in time in logged onto the internet and change in time in outside sociability. Because there's this hypothesis that the more time people spent logged onto the internet, the less sociable they became. Apart from the fact that they might actually be socializing on the internet. Now, my hypothesis here was that was a sort of stock and flow question, that Norman Nye had got this factoid from looking at the stock of nerds who had computers in California in the later 90s, and this wasn't actually about acquiring a computer, but that the sort of people who played with computers in California in the late 90s weren't particularly sociable. You know, they were anoraks and astronomers, I think, was my rude description of these guys. But of course, if rather than looking cross-sectionally at the difference between people who have screens and people who don't have screens, you actually look longitudinally at the effect of getting those screens, which is what we were able to do with the panel study, we did actually find a positive, to my delight, a positive association that found that people who spent more time on the internet actually went out more as well, for obvious reasons. What are you doing on the internet, after all, except finding out what's on and fixing up with your friends to go there? So you can actually use this sort of evidence behaviourally to try to work out, and that we're beginning to accumulate some data of this sort. We've got this panel data for the UK, this is the Home Online study, which is available to download. There's also a 2-wave panel study from the most extraordinary collection of 6 countries. I think it's the UK, France, Luxembourg, Germany, Israel, and Bulgaria, and one more that I've forgotten. It was an EU project, and we kept some internet diary information on these countries. And again, people have played with the data, but it's there waiting to be looked at.
We've also found with the survey data that the sociability argument actually has more evidence in support of it than even with survey data.
Excellent. Even with cross-sectional survey data.
With the internet, there is an increase in collaborative forms of production.
Yep.
Would you classify that as unpaid work? And if classified as unpaid work, in your graph, there is an assumption that there is no export of unpaid work.
How very interesting. That's absolutely right, because my information on imports and exports is all about time embodied in goods and services. I'm dependent on what people say in the diaries that they collect, and we try to work out when people are, for example, using the internet. We try to work out what they're doing. Is it something that's associated with? And here we would be making the sort of assumption. An assumption that goes along the lines of this is the sort of thing that's normally associated with paid work rather than unpaid work. So it's unlikely that there are factually unpaid, in fact, unpaid activities that are nevertheless paid work like, those would normally go into paid work in just the same way that, you know, the time that I spend, you know, late at night writing on my, I mean, I don't get paid either more or less, at least in the short term, as a result of writing late at night. So it's unpaid in that sense. But nevertheless, it's activity that relates to my paid work, and that would be classified as paid work, even though it's unpaid, if you see what I mean.
And in your first slide, there was that idea of reciprocity.
Yeah.
How then does it relate to collaborative development if you classify this as paid work?
That's a problem, and I hadn't thought about it in those terms. What I think I would be saying is that I mean, you're quite right that sort of collaboration which takes place between colleagues on a long-term basis is reciprocity, not exchange. But nevertheless, I'm afraid that the activity as captured in the diary would get included in paid work rather than unpaid work. And I think there is some justification for that. And the justification is that it's actually contributing to the productivity of to the money type productivity of the economy. You know, the extra work that professional people do in time that they're not spending in their offices, you know, if they're actually spending time reading professional literature or writing or whatever, despite the fact they're not being paid for it, it is part of their paid. I think it's right to consider that as being part of their paid work. So I think that's the way we deal with it in terms of the classification system. About what the purpose of the activity is really, and it's part of a purpose that's shared with employment, and possibly a purpose that's shared with other parts of your day.
I was thinking, for instance, of the Wikipedia.
Which is a different, yeah.
Now that's a different.
Software development.
That's very interesting, and that's a different issue. And I think that I would probably misclassify it as part of the money economy, even though it's all done entirely voluntarily. But you know, this is the sort of thing that happens with national income accountancy all the time. You know, the wrong thing gets placed in the wrong because of the general principles that underlie. But you can put it right. You know, I can say that, you know, part of this time, you know, if I can actually work out, you know, if you do me a survey now that tells me that 2 minutes of the great day is devoted to Wikipedia and similar activities, I will happily deduct that from the time of, you know, from the average time that I've allocated, you know, from the minutes of the great day that I've allocated to paid work, and put it in unpaid work with a footnote. You know, what you've identified very smartly is a real problem in the detail of the classification system, which in fact is not the problem, but an opportunity for you to write another footnote.
So it's an obvious thought. I mean, maybe it was already in your analysis, but one of the things I've thought about during my talk, I mean, you'd probably say, is it's only in modernity, isn't it, in modern times, that the technologies go across all the categories. I'm presuming you'd never have asked a mill worker in the 19th century, you know, how much do you use this machine for leisure? But now, of course, we've got a whole range of, because it's a stupid question. But now, I mean, a car started, I mean, the tax people want to know how much of the car is business, how much is pleasure. But the computer is the extreme case, isn't it? Because unless they're honest with you, there's no external check, is there?
None whatsoever. That's right. But I'm not sure I would go. I mean, all these differences between modernity and ancient times, which you're very confident about when you first of all say, the more you think about it, the more you come to the conclusion. Okay, well, you know, there's the horse. Now, what's the horse actually being used? Okay, it's a cart horse. No. It's a cart horse, okay, and it's pulling a cart much of the time. But if it takes you to market on market day, as opposed to taking your hay to, well, I don't.
Does a horse count as technology under your definition? It probably does.
Yeah, probably. Yes, yeah, it would. Yeah, it certainly would. Yeah, it's part of the technological system for delivery once.
What sorts of communication technologies
Yeah,
which
I'd be very reluctant to attribute particular sorts of information characteristics to post-modernity than to pre-modernity, whenever that was.
Well, the internet crosses more of the categories.
It crosses more of the category, but then, how about the electric telegraph? I mean, there's wonderful book about the that's actually called The First Internet, which is about the leisure uses, has a large element of discussion about the leisure and recreational uses of the electric telegraph in the 1860s. And presumably before that, the old telegraph must have been put to some leisure or at least sporting purposes, I suspect.
But one of the themes of the internet literature is this boundary spanning, where it's not simply leisure versus work. It's, for example, the workplaces. You can read the newspaper at work. You can do your work while you're at home, and this boundary. But can you look at
Bill,
that?
bosses are always like this, aren't they? Bill, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it was possible to read the newspaper at work even before the internet.
Really? but no boss.
I even have a certain amount of evidence of that.
Personal anecdote. Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been lovely, and actually now, I mean, it's really a great overview of the kinds of data sets you have and your interests, and I hope you'll have many more discussions with other people here about potential areas in which we could draw from that data for questions that people have here. And thank you very much, Jay. Absolutely.